Before the story begins, take a second to comment where you're watching from. What you're about to hear is about a man who built an empire without ever pulling a trigger. A man who controlled the streets of America's underbelly without raising his voice above a whisper. They called him the quietest man in the room and the most dangerous. If you're ready to dive into a world where silence is power and patience is the deadliest weapon, don't forget to like this video. And if you want more stories from the dark corners of American crime history, hit that subscribe button right now. This is the story of Vincent Marsh, the man who never raised his voice. Vincent Marsh was born in the winter of 1952 in a three-room apartment above a bakery on the south side of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The kind of neighborhood where the streetlights flickered more than they stayed on, where the corner store owner kept a baseball bat under the counter, and where everyone knew everyone else's business, whether they wanted to or not. His father, Thomas Marsh, worked double shifts at the steel mill until the day the furnace accident took his right arm and his will to keep fighting. After that, Thomas became a ghost in his own home, present but absent, staring at walls like they held answers to questions he'd stopped asking. Vincent's mother, Eleanor, worked as a seamstress, her fingers bleeding through fabric every night to keep food on a table that felt emptier with every passing year. Vincent learned early that the world didn't reward noise. It rewarded observation. He was 11 years old when he saw his first real crime. Not the petty shoplifting his classmates bragged about, but something that mattered. Something that changed the architecture of power in his neighborhood. It was a Tuesday afternoon in July, the kind of heat that made asphalt soft and tempers shorter. Vincent was sitting on the front stoop of his building, watching the street like he always did, when three men in dark suits pulled up in a black Cadillac. They didn't rush. They didn't shout. They simply walked into Moretti's diner across the street, stayed for exactly 7 minutes, and walked back out. When they left, Angelo Moretti, the loud, brash owner who'd run that diner for 15 years, was different. Quieter. His hands shook when he poured coffee the next morning. Within a month, the diner had new ownership. Within 2 months, Angelo had disappeared entirely. Vincent never forgot the lesson. Real power doesn't announce itself. It simply is. Throughout his teenage years, Vincent watched. He watched the neighborhood bookies operate out of the barbershop. He watched the numbers runners collect from the corner boys. He watched the loan sharks offer hope and collect despair. He watched the men in expensive suits who drove expensive cars and never seemed to work a day in their lives, yet owned everything that mattered. And he never said a word. His silence made him invisible. His invisibility made him valuable. By the time Vincent turned 19, he dropped out of high school, not because he was stupid, but because the education he needed wasn't being taught in classrooms. He took a job at Bailey's Auto Repair on Fletcher Avenue, a legitimate business that served as a front for less legitimate activities. The owner, Frank Bailey, was an associate of the Corello family, one of several organized crime groups operating in the tri-state area during the 1970s. Vincent didn't ask to be involved in the illegal side of things. He simply worked. He showed up early, stayed late, and kept his mouth shut. He fixed cars during the day and watched money change hands at night. He learned the rhythm of the operation. When shipments came in, how the books were cooked, who got paid, and who got buried. Frank Bailey noticed him after 6 months. "You don't talk much, do you, kid?" Frank said one evening, after everyone else had gone home. Vincent looked up from the engine he was rebuilding. "I talk when there's something worth saying." Frank laughed, a deep, genuine sound. "Smart. You know how many guys I've had to bury because they couldn't keep their mouths shut." Vincent didn't answer. He didn't need to. You ever think about making real money? Frank asked. Depends on the work, Vincent replied, his voice even, calm. Frank studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I like you, kid. You got something most guys don't have. You got patience. That conversation changed Vincent's life. Frank Bailey became Vincent's first real teacher in the world beneath the world. Not through lectures or grand explanations, but through observation and opportunity. Frank didn't tell Vincent how the business worked. He simply let Vincent see it, piece by piece, transaction by transaction. Vincent's first real job came 3 weeks later. It was simple. Drive a package from Millbrook to a warehouse in Chester, 40 miles south. Don't open it. Don't ask questions. Just deliver it and come back. Vincent did exactly that. No questions.
No curiosity.
When he returned, Frank handed him $500 in cash, more money than Vincent had ever held in his life. You know what that was? Frank asked. No, Vincent said honestly. Heroin. Enough to put you away for 20 years if you'd been caught. Vincent's expression didn't change. He simply nodded. Frank smiled. Most guys would be sweating right now, asking me why I didn't tell them. You don't even blink. That's why you're gonna go far, kid. Over the next 2 years, Vincent became Frank's most reliable courier, then his bookkeeper, then his problem solver. But Vincent never carried a gun, never threw a punch, never raised his voice. When a debtor refused to pay, Vincent didn't threaten him. He simply sat across from the man in a quiet diner booth and laid out the mathematics of consequences. He spoke in a calm, measured tone, almost friendly, as he explained exactly what would happen to the man's business, his family, his future, if the debt wasn't settled by Friday. The debt was always settled. When a rival crew tried to muscle in on one of Frank's gambling operations, Vincent didn't organize a hit. He researched. He found out who supplied the rival crew's product, who they owed money to, who their weak points were. Then he made a single phone call to the right person, and the problem resolved itself when the rival crew suddenly found themselves cut off from their supply chain and drowning in debts they couldn't pay. Vincent understood something that most men in that world never learned. Violence is expensive, messy, and attracts attention. Information is cheap, clean, and invisible. By 1975, when Vincent was 23 years old, Frank Bailey trusted him with everything. The books, the contacts, the operations. Vincent had become indispensable, not through force, but through reliability. And then Frank Bailey made a mistake. It was a cold November night when Frank called Vincent to his office above the auto shop. Frank looked tired, older than his 56 years. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to Vincent. I need to tell you something, Frank said, his voice heavy.
I'm sick.
Cancer. Doctors give me 6 months, maybe less. Vincent sipped his whiskey and waited. I've been thinking about what happens next, Frank continued. The Corellos, they're going to want to put one of their guys in charge here. Some loudmouth idiot who'll run this thing into the ground within a year. What do you want to happen? Vincent asked. Frank looked at him directly. I want you to take over. But you're young. You're not made. You're not even Italian. The Corellos won't accept it. Then we make them accept it, Vincent said simply. Frank laughed, but it turned into a cough.
How?
By making me the only option. Over the next 4 months, as Frank Bailey's health deteriorated, Vincent executed the quietest consolidation of power anyone in Millbrook had ever seen. He didn't fight for control. He simply made himself irreplaceable. He was the only one who knew where all the money was hidden. The only one who had relationships with the suppliers. The only one who understood the complete network of operations. When Frank finally died in March of 1976, the Corello family sent a representative named Marcus Vitale to assess the situation. Marcus was everything Vincent wasn't: loud, aggressive, quick-tempered. He walked into the auto shop expecting to take over immediately. Vincent met him in Frank's old office. He didn't stand when Marcus entered. He simply gestured to a chair and slid a ledger across the desk. "This is everything," Vincent said quietly. "Every operation, every account, every contact. You're welcome to take over. But before you do, you should know 3 things." Marcus sat down, already annoyed. "What 3 things?" "First, half the people in this book will only work with me. They don't know you. They don't trust you. If you take over, they disappear." "I'll find new people," Marcus snapped. "Second," Vincent continued, his voice never rising, "the police captain who's been on our payroll for 6 years? He only talks to me. The judge who's helped us with warrants? Only me. The customs inspector at the port? Only me." Marcus's jaw tightened. "And third," Vincent said, leaning back in his chair, "Frank set up a dead man switch. If anything happens to me, anything at all, certain information gets delivered to certain federal authorities. Information that would destroy the Corello family's operations in 3 states. It was a bluff. There was no dead man switch. But Marcus didn't know that. And Vincent's calm, measured delivery made it sound absolutely true. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, then slowly smiled. "You're a cold son of a bitch, aren't you?" "I'm a practical man," Vincent replied. "Frank built something good here. I intend to keep it running smoothly. The Corellos get their cut, same as always. Probably more, if I'm being honest, because I'm better at this than Frank was. You can fight me, waste time and resources trying to replace me, and maybe succeed. Or you can go back to your bosses and tell them you've secured a reliable, profitable operation with minimal risk." Marcus stood up. "I need to make a call." 2 days later, Vincent received word from the Corello family. He would remain in charge of the Millbrook operations. He would report to Marcus Vitale. He would deliver a higher percentage to the family. And if he ever stepped out of line, he would disappear. Vincent agreed to all of it. He was 24 years old, and he'd just taken control of a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise without firing a single shot. The late 1970s and early 1980s were Vincent Marsh's golden years. While other criminals were fighting territorial wars that left bodies in the streets and attracted federal attention, Vincent was building something different. Something sustainable. He operated out of the same auto shop where he'd started, refusing the luxury offices and expensive cars that other bosses flaunted. He drove a modest Ford sedan. He lived in a comfortable but unremarkable house in a middle-class neighborhood. He dressed well but not ostentatiously, tailored suits in muted colors, nothing flashy. He understood that visibility was vulnerability. Vincent expanded the operation methodically. He never rushed. Every new venture was carefully researched, every new partner thoroughly vetted. He diversified gambling, loan sharking, labor union corruption, cargo theft, real estate fraud. But he stayed away from the drug trade as much as possible, recognizing that narcotics attracted the kind of federal heat that could destroy everything. His management style was unique in the criminal underworld. He never yelled, never threatened, never used violence as a first resort or even a second or third resort. When one of his numbers runners, a man named Eddie Breslin, was caught skimming money, most bosses would have had Eddie beaten or killed. Vincent did neither. Instead, he invited Eddie to dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant on the edge of town. They sat in a back booth. Vincent ordered for both of them, made small talk about Eddie's family, asked about his daughter's upcoming wedding. Then, over dessert, Vincent said quietly, "Eddie, I know about the money." Eddie's face went white. His hands started shaking. Vincent continued in the same calm tone, "I know you took it because your daughter's medical bills are crushing you. I know you're desperate. I understand that. Mr. Marsh, Vincent held up a hand. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pay back what you took, but not all at once. We'll work out a payment plan, and I'm going to help with your daughter's medical bills. Consider it an advance on future earnings." Eddie looked like he might cry. "Why would you do that?" "Because you're good at your job, Eddie. Because you've been loyal for 8 years. Because everyone makes mistakes when they're desperate. But this is your one mistake. The next one, there's no dinner. There's no conversation. Do you understand?" Eddie nodded, unable to speak. "Good," Vincent said, smiling warmly. "Now tell me about this wedding. I'd like to send a gift." That story spread through Vincent's organization like wildfire. Not because Vincent told it, he never spoke about such things, but because Eddie told everyone. And the message was clear. Loyalty and honesty would be rewarded. Betrayal would be punished. But Vincent would always give you a chance to make things right. It made him more feared than any violent boss could ever be, because his people never knew which version they would get, the merciful one or the final one. Vincent also understood the importance of legitimate business. He invested his criminal profits into real companies, a chain of laundromats, several apartment buildings, a small construction firm, a restaurant supply company. He hired real accountants, real lawyers, real business managers. He paid taxes on his legitimate income. He became a respected businessman in Millbrook. By 1983, Vincent was 31 years old and controlled criminal operations across 4 counties. The Corello family was making more money from his territory than from any of their other operations. Marcus Vitale, who'd initially been sent to replace Vincent, had become one of his strongest advocates within the family. Vincent had achieved something rare in the criminal world: stability and growth without constant warfare. But power, no matter how carefully built, always attracts envy. The first real challenge to Vincent's authority came from within. A young, ambitious member of the Corello family named Tony Scalisi started making noise about how the Millbrook operations should be run by a real family, not by some outsider who never got his hands dirty. Tony was everything Vincent had avoided being: loud, violent, reckless. He was also connected, the nephew of a high-ranking Corello captain, which gave him protection and influence. Most bosses would have seen Tony as a direct threat and moved to eliminate him. Vincent took a different approach. He invited Tony to join him for a week to shadow his operations and see how things really worked. Tony, confident and eager to find fault, agreed immediately. Vincent showed Tony everything: the accounting systems that kept them invisible to federal investigators, the network of legitimate businesses that laundered money so cleanly that even the IRS couldn't trace it, the relationships with union officials that gave them control over construction contracts worth millions, the police officers and judges on the payroll, the intricate web of information sources that allowed them to avoid law enforcement operations before they even began. After 5 days, Tony was exhausted just trying to keep up with the complexity of it all. On the final evening, Vincent took Tony to dinner at the same quiet restaurant where he'd confronted Eddie Breslin years earlier. "So," Vincent said calmly, "what do you think?" Tony was quiet for a moment, perhaps the first time Vincent had ever seen him not talking. It's a lot more complicated than I thought." "It is," Vincent agreed. "This operation generates $12 million a year in pure profit for the family. It does so without drawing federal attention, without gang wars, without bodies in the streets. Do you know why?" Tony shook his head. "Because it's boring," Vincent said with a slight smile. "It's paperwork and phone calls and patience. It's knowing when to move and when to wait. It's relationships built over years, not territories taken in a single night. That's not the kind of work that makes exciting stories, but it's the kind of work that lasts." Vincent leaned forward slightly. "You're a capable man, Tony. You're ambitious. You want to prove yourself. I respect that. But this operation doesn't need someone to come in and shake things up. It needs someone who understands that real power is invisible." He paused, then added, "However, I'm expanding into Atlantic City. I need someone to manage the gambling interests there. It's visible, it's exciting, there's room to make your own reputation." "Interested?" Tony stared at him, realizing what Vincent was doing. He was being offered a real position of power, but one that would take him out of Millbrook and away from challenging Vincent's authority. "Atlantic City," Tony repeated slowly. 12% of the profits go to you directly," Vincent said. "Full autonomy over operations, as long as you hit the numbers we agree on. You build it right, you could be running the whole eastern seaboard in 5 years." Tony thought about it, then extended his hand.
Deal.
They shook. The threat was neutralized. Tony went on to build a successful operation in Atlantic City and became one of Vincent's most loyal associates, never realizing that Vincent had turned a potential enemy into an asset without ever raising his voice or making a threat. But not every problem could be solved with patience and opportunity. In 1985, federal authorities launched Operation Iron Curtain, a massive investigation into organized crime across the northeastern United States. The FBI had been building cases for 3 years, using new RICO statutes to target entire criminal organizations rather than individual crimes. Dozens of mobsters were arrested. Families that had operated for decades were dismantled. And the investigation was getting closer to the Corello family. Vincent had seen it coming. He'd been preparing for 18 months, carefully insulating himself from direct criminal activity. His legitimate businesses were clean. His illegal operations were run through layers of insulation. He never touched drugs, never attended meetings where criminal activity was discussed openly, never put anything incriminating in writing. When the arrests came, the Corello family lost 7 high-ranking members, including 2 underbosses. Marcus Vitale was arrested and, facing 30 years in federal prison, agreed to cooperate with investigators. Vincent wasn't touched, not even questioned. The family was in chaos, but Vincent's operations continued smoothly, generating money when the family desperately needed it. The new leadership, younger, more paranoid, more violent, needed Vincent more than ever. But they also resented him. Resented that he'd survived when so many others had fallen. Resented his independence. Resented that he'd never been made, never taken the blood oath that supposedly bound them all together. The new boss, Leo Corsetti, was different from the old leadership. He was 42, ruthless, and believed that respect came from fear, not from patience. Their first meeting took place in a social club in Philadelphia. Vincent arrived alone, as requested. The room was full of made men, all of them watching him with hostile eyes. Leo didn't offer pleasantries. "We have concerns about your operation." "What concerns?" Vincent asked calmly. "You survived a federal investigation that destroyed half our family. That makes people nervous." Vincent nodded slowly. "I survived because I'm careful. Because I plan ahead. Because I don't do business in ways that leave evidence." "Or because you made a deal," another man said from across the room. Vincent turned his gaze to the speaker, his expression never changing. "If I'd made a deal, every person in this room would already be in federal custody. The fact that you're here, free and operating, should tell you everything you need to know about my loyalty." Leo leaned forward. "From now on, you report directly to me. Every week. In person. And we're putting one of our guys as your second in command. Someone we trust." Vincent remained silent for a long moment, understanding what was happening. They were trying to control him, to diminish his independence. They were also testing him, to see if he would push back. "I'll report monthly," Vincent said finally. "In person is fine. But I choose my own second in command. I'll make sure he's someone you approve of, someone with family connections. But he works for me, not for you. If you can't trust me to run my own operation after 13 years of profit and loyalty, then maybe it's time we part ways." The room went silent. No one spoke to Leo Corsetti like that. Leo stared at Vincent for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly he smiled. "You got balls, Marsh. I'll give you that."
Fine.
"Monthly reports. You pick your second, but we approve him. And your tribute goes up 5%. 3%, Vincent countered. 4, Leo said. Vincent nodded. 4. He left that meeting knowing that he'd bought himself time, but that the relationship had fundamentally changed. The old leadership had valued stability. The new leadership valued control. And Vincent Marsh did not like being controlled. The years 1986 through 1989 were profitable but tense. Vincent continued to run his operations with the same careful precision, but he could feel the structure around him shifting. The Corello family was becoming more violent, more reckless, more visible. The new generation of mobsters had grown up watching movies about gangsters and thought that's how the life was supposed to be lived. Loud, flashy, brutal. Vincent maintained his relationships, kept his operations clean, and started quietly moving money into offshore accounts. He wasn't planning to run, not yet, but he was preparing for the possibility that the whole thing might collapse. He was 37 years old, wealthy beyond what he'd ever imagined as a kid in Millbrook, but increasingly isolated. He'd never married, never had children. His closest relationships were with people who worked for him, which meant they were never truly close at all. The only person who understood him was Sarah Brennan, a woman he'd met at a charity fundraiser in 1987. She ran a legitimate art gallery in Philadelphia and had no connection to his world. She knew what he did. It was impossible not to, given his reputation, but she'd never asked for details, never judged him, never tried to change him. They'd been seeing each other quietly for 2 years, meeting in out-of-the-way restaurants, taking weekend trips to places where no one knew either of them. It was the closest thing to a normal life Vincent had ever experienced. Sarah was the only person who ever challenged him emotionally. "You're going to end up alone," she told him one evening, as they sat in her apartment watching the city lights. "You've built this whole empire on silence and distance. But silence is just another kind of prison, Vincent." "I'm not in prison," he replied quietly. "Aren't you? You can't trust anyone. You can't be honest with anyone. You can't even tell me where you're really going or what you're really doing half the time. That's not freedom. That's just a different kind of cage. Vincent didn't answer because he knew she was right. In September of 1989, Vincent made the decision that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Leo Corsetti approached him with an opportunity, a major heroin distribution network coming through the port of Philadelphia. It would triple the family's drug profits within a year. Vincent refused. "I don't do drugs," he said simply. "I never have. That's always been the arrangement." Leo's face hardened. "That's not an arrangement. That's a privilege. And I'm revoking it. This deal is happening. You're either in or you're out." "Then I'm out," Vincent said. It was the first time he'd directly defied the family leadership. It was also the moment Leo Corsetti decided that Vincent Marsh was a problem that needed to be solved. The hit was planned carefully. Leo knew that Vincent was protected by layers of insulation, by relationships, by information he'd accumulated over years. You couldn't just kill Vincent Marsh. The consequences would ripple through too many operations. So Leo decided to dismantle him first. It started with small things. Shipments that went missing. Contacts who suddenly stopped returning calls. Police raids that seemed oddly well-timed. Vincent recognized it immediately. He was being sabotaged from within. He traced it back to his second-in-command, a man named Paul Romano. Paul was family approved by Leo, and he'd been working for Vincent for 3 years. Vincent had trusted him with significant responsibility. That had been a mistake. Vincent didn't confront Paul directly. Instead, he did what he always did. He observed, he gathered information, he planned. He discovered that Paul had been reporting to Leo for over a year, that the sabotage was designed to make Vincent look incompetent, to give Leo justification for removing him. And once Vincent was removed, he would be killed, quietly, cleanly, with Leo already controlling all of Vincent's operations. For the first time in his life, Vincent considered violence. Not personally, he'd never even held a gun, but he considered arranging it. One call to the right people, and Paul Romano would disappear. Another call, and Leo Corsetti would have an accident. But he didn't make those calls. Because Vincent Marsh had spent 20 years building power on the principle that violence was expensive and stupid. And he wasn't going to abandon that principle now, even if it meant his own destruction. Instead, he went to Sarah. "I need to disappear," he told her, "and I need you to come with me." She looked at him for a long moment. "What happened?" "Nothing yet," Vincent said quietly. "But it's coming. I can stay and fight, and maybe I win, maybe I don't. Or I can walk away, take the money I've saved, start over somewhere far from here. With you." "You're asking me to leave my whole life," Sarah said. "I know. It's not fair. But I'm asking anyway." She turned away, looking out the window at the city she'd lived in her entire life. When she turned back, her eyes were wet. "I can't, Vincent.
I'm sorry.
I care about you, but I can't just disappear into some new life built on running from your old one. That's not who I am." Vincent nodded slowly. He'd expected this, but it still hurt in a way few things ever had. "I understand," he said. He kissed her goodbye and left her apartment for the last time. Vincent Marsh had approximately 2 weeks before Leo Corsetti made his final move. He used them efficiently. He liquidated assets quietly, converting legitimate businesses into cash and wire transfers. He settled debts, paid out bonuses to his most loyal people, and transferred certain operations to associates he trusted. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing or where he was going. The offshore accounts he'd been building for years, now held just over $42 million. Enough to live comfortably for multiple lifetimes, in places where American law enforcement had no jurisdiction. But before he disappeared, Vincent had one final piece of business. He arranged a meeting with Leo Corsetti on neutral ground, a restaurant in Atlantic City, public enough that Leo wouldn't try anything violent, private enough for a real conversation. Leo arrived with 4 bodyguards. Vincent arrived alone. They sat across from each other in a back room, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Vincent said, "I'm leaving." Leo smiled. "Leaving? You don't get to just leave." "Watch me," Vincent replied calmly. "I've transferred all the operations to people you already know and trust. The cash flows continue. Nothing disrupts. I'm simply walking away. And if I don't let you?" Vincent leaned forward slightly. "Then you make the biggest mistake of your life. I've spent 20 years accumulating information, Leo. Every dirty cop, every paid-off judge, every illegal deal, every body that was buried, and where. I've got records of everything the Corello family has done in 4 states for 2 decades. You're bluffing," Leo said, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. "Maybe," Vincent acknowledged. "But are you willing to bet the entire family on it? Because if anything happens to me, anything at all, that information goes to federal authorities automatically. Everything I know, everyone I can name, it would be the biggest RICO case in American history." It was the same bluff he'd used with Marcus Vitali 13 years earlier. But this time, it wasn't entirely a bluff. Vincent had prepared insurance, not quite as comprehensive as he claimed, but enough to cause serious damage. Leo stared at him, hatred burning in his eyes. "You're a coward. You never had the stomach for this life." "You're probably right," Vincent said quietly. "But I'm a rich coward who's going to die of old age somewhere warm. Can you say the same?" He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the door. "Marsh," Leo called after him. Vincent turned. "If you ever come back, if I ever see you again, the deal's off. You understand?" "Perfectly," Vincent said. "Goodbye, Leo." He walked out of the restaurant, got into a rented car, and drove to Philadelphia International Airport. He boarded a flight to Miami under a false identity, then caught a connection to the Cayman Islands. Vincent Marsh vanished from the American criminal underworld as quietly as he'd entered it. 23 years later, in 2012, an old man sat on the balcony of a modest villa overlooking the Caribbean Sea. He was 60 years old, his hair white, his face weathered by decades of sun and stress. He went by a different name now, Robert Mitchell. He told people he was a retired accountant from Ohio. He had no family, no close friends, no real connections to anyone.
He was wealthy,
Comfortable, safe, and utterly, completely alone. Vincent Marsh, or the man who used to be Vincent Marsh, had spent 2 decades in paradise and had never been more miserable. He'd traveled the world, lived in a dozen different countries, experienced luxuries most people only dreamed about. But he'd never stopped being silent, never stopped maintaining distance, never stopped being alone in a room full of people. He'd tried a few times to build real relationships,
but he didn't know how.
The skills that had made him powerful, observation, manipulation, emotional distance, were the same skills that made genuine human connection impossible. He thought about Sarah sometimes. He'd kept tabs on her for years through private investigators, watching from afar as she married a doctor, had 2 children, built a good life. He'd almost contacted her once, but what would he say? That he was sorry? That she'd been right about the cage he'd built for himself? He thought about Eddie Breslin, the numbers runner he'd given a second chance. Eddie had gotten out of the life, started a small business, watched his daughter get married. Eddie had died in 2008, surrounded by family, having lived a full life. Vincent wondered if Eddie had ever thought about him. Probably not. That was the nature of the power Vincent had wielded. Invisible, forgettable. The Corello family had largely collapsed by 2001, destroyed by federal investigations and internal warfare. Leo Corsetti had been murdered by one of his own captains in 1995. Marcus Vitale had testified against dozens of former associates and lived in witness protection somewhere in the Midwest. Tony Scalise had been killed in a gambling dispute in Atlantic City. Most of the men Vincent had known were dead or in prison. He'd survived. He'd won. And he had nothing to show for it except money and memories. Sometimes, late at night, Vincent would sit on his balcony and think about that moment in the restaurant with Leo Corsetti. He'd walked away from power. He'd chosen life over pride. It had been the smart decision, the strategic decision. But part of him wondered if it had been the right decision. Because what good was survival if you had nothing to survive for? He'd built an empire on silence. He'd gained power through restraint. He'd controlled men and operations through patience and intelligence instead of violence. But in the end, all that silence had done was isolate him from the very things that made life worth living. Connection.
Trust. Love.
The man who never raised his voice had also never really spoken at all. In 2015, Vincent Marsh, still living as Robert Mitchell, was diagnosed with terminal cancer. The doctors gave him 6 months, maybe a year with treatment. He declined the treatment. Instead, he spent his final months writing. Not a confession. He had no interest in clearing his conscience or settling scores. But a record. A clinical, detailed account of how power really worked in the American underworld. How you built it, how you maintained it, how you lost it. He never mentioned names. Never included specific details that would implicate anyone who might still be alive. It wasn't meant as evidence or testimony. It was simply documentation. An honest accounting of a life lived in the shadows. When he finished writing, he put the manuscript in a safety deposit box with instructions that it should be sent to a particular journalist 30 years after his death. Enough time that everyone involved would be gone, that it would be history rather than exposure. Then he returned to his villa, sat on his balcony, and waited. He died alone, as he'd always known he would, on a warm October evening in 2016. The local authorities contacted the American consulate, but there was no one to notify. No family. No friends. No one who even knew Robert Mitchell's real name. His money, all $42 million that remained, went to a charity supporting children of incarcerated parents. It was the only moment of genuine altruism in a life defined by calculation and self-interest. Vincent Marsh had built an empire without violence. He'd controlled men without threats. He'd accumulated wealth and power through silence and patience. But in the end, silence was all he had. The world never knew his real story. There were no movies made about him. No books written during his lifetime. He was a footnote, a rumor, a name occasionally mentioned in federal investigations, but never charged with anything. He'd wanted to be invisible, and he'd succeeded completely. The tragedy was that invisibility was indistinguishable from never having existed at all. So there it is. The story of Vincent Marsh. The man who never raised his voice. The man who built an empire on restraint and lost his humanity in the silence. They say power corrupts, But that's not the whole truth. Power isolates. It separates you from everyone and everything real until you're left with nothing but control over a world you can't actually be part of. Vincent proved that you don't need violence to build power in the criminal underworld. You just need patience, intelligence, and the willingness to sacrifice everything else. But every empire built on sacrifice eventually consumes the builder. Every throne built in silence eventually becomes a prison. And every man who makes himself invisible eventually disappears, even from himself. If this story made you think, if it pulled you into Vincent's world and made you feel the weight of all that silence, hit that like button. And if you want more stories exploring the dark psychology of power, the real cost of ambition, and the quiet ways empires rise and fall, subscribe to this channel. Because the most dangerous people aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes, they're the ones you never hear coming at all.